Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now, today we're going to talk about building stronger teams and better performance. We all want that, don't we? But the way that we're going to talk about this today is a bit different. Our guest today is Ed Thompson, who's the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, Hidden Force: Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work. Now, when you think about this, and this is what we're here to talk about, everybody thinks differently. And the better that we can tap into that, the better that we can tap into the outcomes and the inputs of each of the different team members. And Ed is the perfect person to do that. Founder of a business called Optimize, a leading neuro-inclusion training company, educated at Oxford. Ed launched Optimize in 2016, been featured in major outlets like the BBC, Financial Times, worked with police, military people, but today on Practice Growth HQ, he's here to help us grow stronger teams and better performance, all the way from Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Ed.
Yes, thanks for having me. And the accent doesn't match the place.
Indeed, yes. We've been talking. Ed, born in London, educated in Oxford, but now finds himself in the US of A. Ed, we like to start with the fast five, quicker questions, quicker answers, so that people can get to know you quickly. Question one, where did you grow up?
South London.
All right. Question two, favorite book besides your own?
Oh gosh, I might go for any of the biographies of William Wilberforce, who happens to be my direct 4 times great grandfather, great inspiration of mine.
Wow, there you go. I've seen the movie Amazing Grace. I think
Mhm.
that's the one, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a really, wow. I don't, well done. I don't think I've had anybody say that before on the podcast. Question three, what's one of your superpowers?
I think I am pretty good at creative thinking, but also the process side. One comes naturally, one I've developed. But to be an entrepreneur, I think you need to be quite well-rounded. And so combination of luck and hard work, I think I've got a pretty good sort of rounded skill set.
Well done. Question four, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
I think I wouldn't have known for that age my 23-year-old self would have a serious car accident. So I don't know whether I'd want to know that or not. That shaped me significantly. I think what I would tell myself in my 20s as a whole is, as somebody who was quite ambitious and wanting to make their mark in the world and come out of Oxford and thinking, what should I do with myself? To slow down and realize there's plenty of time to build something great.
Okay, interesting. And finally, question five, something you're grateful for.
I'm grateful for and this, I think people always answer these questions the same way, but I'm going to do the same. I'm grateful for my mother, who I lost a couple of years ago. But it was an interesting experience losing a parent for the first time and realizing that what you get from a parent, if you're lucky enough to know them as long as I did, is not just genetics, but is actually a sort of operating system for life. And I realized that although I'd lost her physically, not only did I still, and my son now, carry some of her genes, but actually what I'm passing on to him is a whole operating system for how to interact with people, what matters in the world, how to behave, and so on. And actually, that's quite a special thing.
There we go. All right. Let's get on to the topic then of neurodiversity and neuro-inclusion. Both of those have got the common word, the common thread of neuro in there, which we know is the brain. Just tell us a bit about the space for people who are going, I don't know anything about this, Ed. Like, what's the go here?
Yes. So what you said earlier is the key, that everybody thinks differently. This is a fact of humanity. It's as much a fact as biodiversity is a fact of the natural world. There is no one normal brain. Every brain works differently. That means we all experience the world differently. We have different preferences for how we work, interact, and so on. But that fact has been rather buried, and it's been rather buried by a perspective that is highly medicalized and sees some of the more atypical neurotypes as one side of normal and everybody else on the other side of normal. And what that's done for, say, workplaces is create the assumption that most things work for most people. And there are a few people that things might not work quite so well for. And if so, they'll tell us and we can fix it. And actually, what I think is being better appreciated is that many people have quite markedly different thinking styles. And any team, by definition, is neurodiverse. And we can just wait for people to put their hand up. But actually, most people typically don't want to share if they have a difference for reasons of not wanting to rock the boat or be judged and so on. So what you're seeing organizations do now is be much more proactive about appreciating these differences and looking to do something about them in a positive sense.
Okay, fantastic. Question: is this the same as different learning styles? Is it related or is it completely separate?
That's a great question. This is the sort of question I think everybody should ask. You're the first person to ask me that question. So if we think about, again, what does neurodiversity mean? Neurodiversity means humans all have different brains, right? Now we've constructed, and the medical profession has constructed, diagnostic criteria for certain neurotypes, and perhaps 20% of people would qualify for a diagnosis or already have of one of those neurotypes. What we know, though, and this is, and I'm talking to your audience, what you know of your colleagues, what you know of your patients, is that everybody's brain's different. And actually, the way we think about that is you break it down into a few areas at work. So everybody's different in terms of how we communicate. If you have a team of 5 and you ask them, how would you like me to give you instructions? How do you like to process information? They're going to give you different answers. That's neurodiversity in action. Everybody's different in terms of how they like to problem solve as well. Not everybody is a verbal, visual thinker who wants to spend 2 hours at the whiteboard. Some people might prefer to say, look, give me everything. Let me process it in my own time. Let me come to my own conclusions. Learning, which is the one you asked about, is one of our 4. And I think that's actually the best appreciated difference. And it's been quite a sort of long-held thing. We understand we don't learn the same. And then the last one is really the sensory experience, which relates to environments. And people have different preferences as a result of where they work in terms of what that environment means in terms of distractions and so on. And you could take that even to how people manage their energy and things like that. So we're all different across those axes. That's really the nuts and bolts of neurodiversity.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. I've just written these down. I just want to make sure I've got this. So communicating, problem solving, learning, and the sensory side. And as you say, perhaps the learning diversity is the best or better known of some of the 3 of them. It's more appreciated, but then there are some of these ones that are probably not so much at all. Look, the truth for me, Ed, I've done lots and lots of testing on lots and lots of things. And indeed, I was talking to my assistant yesterday and I said, honestly, you should do every single test you can under the sun, just about, because the more you learn about yourself, the better you can manage yourself. I know, for example, from my learning style, it needs to be heavily visual. If somebody's just talking, they're not engaging the visual at all, my comprehension's terrible. And I know this. When I've just surprised, I've got a whiteboard sitting about 2 meters from me. And even when I'm talking to you now, I'm sitting here taking notes, partly because it helps me to reflect on what you've been speaking about, but partly because that's my learning style. If you and I just talk and I don't get to write down, then I know my comprehension's not nearly as good. So the question for me is, every single listener here, they've got a team, they want better results from the team, and they want to, at some level, we want to make our team members flourish. Let's make it easy for you to grow into the kind of person that you want to be. What are the common mistakes that you see in this space in workplaces? And let's be clear, most of our listeners, their workplaces are going to be, I'm going to say, 5 to 25 people. Maybe some of them have got 30 or 40, but in many cases, healthcare in Australia it tends to be the principal. Maybe they've got 1 or 2 associates and then they've got a bunch of staff. What are the sort of mistakes that the listeners might be making?
I think the fundamental mistake is not appreciating neurodiversity in every interaction. When we did a survey recently, which was in the UK, but actually UK is reasonably advanced on this topic, we found that over a third of professionals didn't even know what neurodiversity was.
Okay.
So I think most interactions, and if we bring this down to a team situation, and the leader of a team, the leader of the practice, I don't know how much you, say, the audience, are currently thinking about this in how you communicate with your team, again, across some of the axes that I've highlighted. Now, I think people think of neurodiversity, and if they know what the term means at all, they start thinking about things like autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on, forms of neurodivergent identity. And I think sometimes either that leads to generalization, stereotype, or it leads a little bit to fear. It don't really know what that means, and so I've
Mhm.
actually, trade away from it. So to get to something more positive, what can you do about it at a basic level? I say this to everybody. I say this to tech company managers. I say this to people who work in all sorts of industries. Start surfacing your preferences in conversation. So if you're the leader of a practice, you're talking to your team, talk about how you like to work, just as you did to me now, Angus. You talk to
Mm.
me about this is how I like to work. I think the more you do that, you show some vulnerability, especially if you show that you're not superhuman. In my case, I need to make notes all the time as well because I had a traumatic brain injury. Otherwise, I won't remember anything.
Mm.
Um, you don't need to be an amateur diagnostician and wondering, oh, who's what, and therefore who needs what. Just have an open conversation about how you like to work. A lot of this is what we call universal design. It's being proactive and thinking about what can we all do all the time, operating in this muddy context where we know everyone thinks differently from how we do. What are some ways that we can manage or collaborate in an inclusive way? You're working in a team, for example, you've got documentation. Make it clear, make it legible. Ask people, does this format work for you? Build this kind of conversational layer to check that how you're working is actually plugging in appropriately to people's different working styles.
Mm. It's funny, as a manager, I am increasingly asking team members about their learning style. And I'll say to them, because I just know what it feels like. They think they've delivered some information to you from A to Z, and I'm sitting there going, I got no idea what you're talking about. And thank God I've got a label for it now, Ed. But I do find myself, and there's times where as a manager I've tried to implement stuff in the team and it just hasn't gone well. And I'm like, what could I have done better? Is it just not? I've just returned from overseas. I've got a team member there, some team members there, and there was something that I wanted to implement. And we had a training session on a Friday afternoon, and I went around the team members one by one. And I said, "Oh, there's this new initiative we've got. Tell me how that works." And I got about 4 or 5 people, and I realized nobody knows what's going on. And it was from that point, it was like, what have I got to do? What is the best way to get the best out of you and make it as easy as possible?
Right.
Ed, other mistakes that we make?
To build, I just want to give people a kind of a phrase, pithy phrase, building on what we were talking about before. I think I have a 2-year-old. That's how I bashed my head here for anyone who's watching the video. But look, one of the lessons we teach kids is treat others like you'd like to be treated yourself.
Yeah.
And of course, in many ways, that makes sense. But actually, that breaks down a little bit when we are collaborating with different brains that experience the world very differently from us and have very strong preferences as a result. So I would say that's the mistake, is to follow that age-old advice and assume how somebody wants to be managed is how you would like to be managed. Now, I know that's a double down on the same point, but I think it's a nice sort of point to consider. And I'm going to introduce another kind of concept here as well, which is the idea of the spiky profile. Are you familiar with that?
No.
And again, this is generic across any work, really. So if we're thinking about what are the sort of work skills in any profession or many professions, you're talking about things like communication. So that could be verbal communication, written communication. It could be creativity. It could be personal organization. It could be prioritization. Some of those just kind of core skills that we all take with us to any role. And the idea of the profile or the spiky profile is that we can all self-score across those pieces. And what you might find is a generalist, and this might be someone who has a more neurotypical profile,
Hmm.
is a sort of 6 or 7 across the board. Reasonably creative, but not necessarily the best. Pretty good organization, pretty good prioritization, reasonable communication, maybe slightly prefers one than the other, but can do everything. You might find a neurodivergent profile being more spiky,
Mm.
and you might find someone who's a 10 for creativity, really unusually
Mm.
creative and brilliant, but someone who's maybe a 4 for prioritization. So it's a question, I think, as a leader to really think about what you want in your team. Now, if you want generalists, there's nothing wrong with that, but
Mm.
it should be an intentional decision, and you should accept that generalists aren't necessarily going to have some of the positive spikes. Now, if we do a metaphor here or a parallel, you think of a sports team. Sports teams are built on the spikes. You
Yes.
don't want someone who's a sort of reasonably good all-rounder on the wing in rugby. You want someone who's extremely fast.
Yeah.
Now, yes, we need them to be okay at some other things as well, but we're building our team off strength. So I just want people to be conscious of that concept.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about, I've got a marketing agency, among other businesses. And if you were to take what I'll call old fashioned thinking, which is, oh, that person just doesn't fit into the box, they don't conform, etc., you might discover that they're one of these spiky profiles and that lo and behold, they're a 10 out of 10 on creativity. And it's like, what an opportunity missed just because you go, oh, they're a bit unusual over here, or whatever you said, they're kind of quote unquote normal. But to go, let's find a way to get past those other things because then we can tap into this stuff where this person's a 10 out of 10 on. And I think in years gone by, we probably wouldn't have done that. The the problem solving is an interesting one for me too. And you already alluded to this, Ed. I've done Myers-Briggs many times, and I know that I'm slightly on the extroverted style. And we used to think that extroverted was who's the life of the party or who's not. But in fact, it's really about your thinking style. And for me, when I want to do problem solving and thinking, I need other people with me. I'll sometimes call meetings and we'll talk through stuff. And I've even had a good friend of mine said, Angus, you'll call me to discuss a problem, and you're not really that interested in what I think. It's just that it's you doing your thinking out loud. But that process can be very frustrating for the more introverted people. My wife's quite introverted in her thinking. She would rather get all the facts, as you alluded to before, go away, have a chance to think through it herself, and then, for example, come to a meeting with her thoughts gathered. And as a leader, what I've found is for those people, it's you better ask them because in many cases they've got the best ideas. They just don't happen to be the most forthright person in the meeting because they're not the sort of extroverted personalities.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one of our subject matter experts here who is very similar to you, and she's made that clear. She knows that's how her brain works, so she needs that verbal time to get in the zone, and that's when ideas come out that maybe then she can work on
Mm.
in her own time. And I think what a lot of this is just learning that about each other, learning that about ourselves as well. You mentioned some of the sort of psychometric tools, of which, of course, there are a plethora. There are people in the neurodivergent community who are quite anti those tools, find them
Okay.
difficult, confusing. Personally, I like them for the same reason that you did, because I think they're thought starters
Mm.
and they get us thinking about this whole topic, which, of course, is the topic we're passionate about. But where I think sometimes they break down is the desire for the simple labeling. And this is not a sort of Myers-Briggs, but the idea of us doing a tool and finding out that, let's say, Ed's an introvert, Angus is an extrovert. Yes, that helps us have a conversation, but how much does it really help us
Mm.
work together? So I think what we've got to do is use those tools to fuel that deeper conversation about, well, what does that actually mean for how you like to work? I want to make one other point about how we like to problem solve, because this relates to another huge topic, which is interruption. Now, interruptions are endemic at work. Now,
Yep.
you might say that this is simply how your business works. It's just, we're all just juggling things all the time. That's fine, and that may be the case. And you then want to hire people who will suit that sort of workplace. But there is a real, I think, rise in attention of the fact that deep work is valuable as well.
Mm,
And the way that we all typically use communication tools as synchronous tools, even when they're not meant to be,
mm,
is not very conducive to deep work. And there are neurodivergent people who particularly work to get into a flow state, who can then be fantastically productive in that state, but for whom even a minor interruption or a minor change can completely throw that off. So I think it's worth, as you learn and you have these conversations with your team, understanding communication, problem solving, and that sort of nexus with how they like to work, and they're getting into that flow state, which ultimately I would assume at times is what you want them to be doing in order to do the proper work you're hiring them for.
yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point, the sort of deep work. I've said to team members on many occasions, particularly when people are newly starting in a job or newly promoted, I'm saying, look, there are certain things you just need to do to be doing a reasonable job. You need to be keeping on top of your communication, whether that's email or whatever else. But your ability to do an outstanding job's got nothing to do with any of that. Like, your ability to do an outstanding job is at 12 months' time to be able to point back and say, here are the three big achievements that I made. Here are the three needle movers. And they tend not to be just because, your desk's tidy or you answer each email within an hour or something. That stuff's there, but that's not the stuff that's really, for me as a CEO, it's this organization's not going from good to great because I keep a very neat calendar. It's like, where are those times where I get to spend potentially a couple of hours or maybe even a day? And I'm like, what should I be doing? What is the number one issue facing the company? How can I think about a whole kind of strategy for that and then bring that in? And getting
Yeah,
to
it's a
that,
huge, I mean, not so much there. Yeah.
yeah, like it, and yet that can be quite difficult. The listeners, they're like, okay, we get it. Step one, basically just have more awareness of the fact that people think differently. And hopefully we've given enough examples that you get a sense of that. What else can we be doing proactively now, Ed, to really, maybe the listeners have got a team member who feels like they don't quite fit into the box. Their heart's in the right place. We're not talking about people who just don't want to be there, but somehow they just don't seem to be getting the best out of them.
Yeah. And of course, there's so many millions and infinite examples of why that might be the case with that thinking style interfacing with that management style and that in that environment and those tasks. But just a couple of things to think about. We talked about the spiky profile thing. I want to talk about what's called outcome oriented management. So the idea that people are going to have different paths to get to the answer, and welcoming as much as you can the answer, the ends over the means. And that's quite important because, again, some neurodivergent people might be quite lateral thinkers as opposed to, and of course, some are very logical, bottom up thinkers. But basically, the way people get to answers is different. And I want to talk about hiring in a second, but we've had situations where we've heard from neurodivergent professionals that they've gone to interviews, they've been asked a question, they come up with the answer, but the way they came up with the answer wasn't how the interviewers wanted them to come up with the answer. In a sense, they've gone round the back and gone through the back door.
Mm.
And the interviewer said, no, you should get there like I got there. Why? So I think that's an important piece as well. And there's always this tension, I think, with process and with creativity. But the more you allow people to work in their way, I think the better. And then there's a huge piece here as well around hiring. I think it's a mistake to think of the neurodivergent community as this sort of tiny community on the fringe of society. And as if I don't have anybody like that here. No, we're all different. We all think differently. Most neurodivergent people aren't going to tell you because they're going to be worried about how you might respond. So this is something we should just be baking into everything we do. So if we're interviewing somebody, and whether or not they disclose to us and said, by the way, I'm dyslexic or whatever, you've really got to challenge some biases there. We talk a lot about, do you have a mental picture of the candidate, which I think most people typically do. But where's that come from? And that mental picture is generally purely the result of biases. Now, what happens if you have a candidate who is non-speaking or partially non-speaking, doesn't, and actually prefers to communicate in a different way? What if you have a candidate who doesn't make much eye contact because they find that talking to you and making eye contact at the same time is a sort of sensory overload?
Mm.
What if you have a candidate who's the best qualified on paper, has written you a great cover letter, but has quite a flat speech affect? Do you think to yourself, they sound a bit bored? Do they really want
Mm.
it? Or do you
Mm.
think to yourself, actually, they wouldn't be here if they didn't want it, so let's give them the best chance? There's a lot of kind of facets of this, but it all comes from that basis that we talked about. Think about it all the time. You'll start seeing the places that you can act.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Ed. I think it's a space that many of us will be aware of at some level, although as you noted, I think you said a third of professionals had never heard of it. But at the very least in this episode, we've managed to raise people's awareness. And hopefully, as you start to think about that, I dare say each of the listeners has perhaps got one or two members in their team where they go, there's something that's just not quite gelling, and there's a chance to have a conversation there and say, is this working for you? What can we do that's a bit differently? And I think your examples in an interview and context are fantastic, because I must admit I do a lot of interviewing. And yes, there are times where it's, come on, get into the box. That's what I need you to do, instead of going, hang on, this person's approach, it's a bit unusual, but it actually seems like they could get some pretty good results.
Yeah, I learned the same lesson. I remember, this is slightly different, but I remember interviewing somebody, one of our focus groups. We talked to people in the community, and neurodivergent community, understand what barriers they faced at work, because they're seeing the kind of cutting edge of this.
Mm.
And what might be suboptimal for somebody who doesn't consider themselves neurodivergent, if their manager doesn't quite care about their thinking style, is actually mission critical for a neurodivergent person. So we want to hear their stories. And we interviewed somebody wanting these kind of pithy sound bites, because that's what we're going to use in our training. And we say to them, look, just say these short sentences. And this lady said, yeah, I'll do that. And then in the end was just extremely verbose, to the point when I was slightly struggling to stay engaged. I was certainly thinking we didn't follow my instructions. Now, when we went back and we looked at that transcript, that was one of the most insightful, honest thing I've seen in this space. And it was just a different style.
Yeah, yes, very interesting. All right, Ed, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. If people want to learn more or get in touch, what should they do?
Yeah, so my book, A Hidden Force, is on Amazon and other outlets. That's a good place to start if you're just interested in, what is this? Why are we talking about it now? If it's a sort of fundamental thing about humans. I'm a history guy, so I talk a little bit about where this has all come from, and then what can we all do about it as generically as possible. My company is optimize.com. If anyone's interested in some support or consultancy. I'm on LinkedIn, Ed Thompson, as well. Find me there. Would love to hear from you. I'm interested in neurodiversity's or the embracing of neurodiversity's application in all sorts of contexts. So if you listen to this episode, find it valuable, do reach out to Angus or myself and tell us. We'd certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. So it's Ed Thompson with a P. I did Google Ed earlier and I thought, oh, that's a really common name. And I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that Ed was appearing quite strongly in the first page of search results. So Ed Thompson with a P. Optimize, that's, I suppose, it's UPTIMIZE.com. And
Yeah,
Ed's
the American Z.
Yeah. And Ed's book, A Hidden Force, Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work, and that's on Amazon. Once again, Ed, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.